third talk in this presentation series will focus on the topic raised by the first of our guest speakers at ZDAY London 2013, positive money. This monetary reform group rightly points out the negative consequences of fractional reserve banking, its impact on the economy, and the much needed immediate solution set that could start to address this issue. For more information on their position, please watch Ben Dyson's talk from ZDAY by clicking on the link in the description for this video. The title for our joint event following ZDAY was Why Modern Economics is Failing Us and What Are the Alternatives? The story of the battle over the creation of a nation's money supply, as well as variations on the solution being offered by monetary reform groups such as Positive Money, is in fact not a new phenomenon, but rather a return to an old and well-trodden battleground. One almost as old as money itself, and certainly as old as banks. This is the battle over who gets to create a nation's money supply, the people or private interests, the government or the money changers as they are sometimes known. It's not my intention to focus in great detail on this long-running script of money creation, but rather to give an outline of the issue. Nor will I go into great detail regarding the proposed alternative economic model that the Zeitgeist Movement advocates, as it is well covered in our other materials. If you wish to look into the detail of what I present further regarding money, then I would recommend watching Part 3 of Zeitgeist the Movie, or Part 1 of Zeitgeist Addendum, as well as the documentaries Money as Debt and The Money Masters, or you could also read the books Web of Debt and The Creature from Jekyll Island. For more information on the NLRBE, please watch the documentary Zeitgeist Moving Forward, as well as checking out the Movement and the Venus Project's websites. As with all long-running stories throughout human history, we can find various imprints of this tale regarding the battle over the creation of a nation's credit in modern culture in the strangest of places. So let us journey to the magical land of Oz, to give this tale a brief introduction. Yes, that's right. The Wizard of Oz does not appear to be just a quaint little tale of a girl and her dog being whisked away to a faraway land of intrigue and adventure, but has been shown to have an allegorical reference regarding the struggle between the people and the banking elite of the late 1800s and early 1900s in America. The author of The Wizard of Oz, Frank Baum, had a keen interest in a political movement known as the Populists, or the People's Party, who, greatly supported by American farmers, championed the notion that money creation should lie in the hands of the government for the needs of the people and not in private hands for private gain. They paid special credence to the idea that the pseudo-empirical basis for money creation should be that of the more plentiful and publicly controlled commodity of silver, rather than the more scarce and banking-controlled one of gold. This background helps to set up the allegory of the story. The central character is Dorothy, who is whisked up in a storm from her simple farming life in Kansas to the magical world of Oz. Oz could stand for ounces, which is of course a commodity measurement, where she must follow the yellow, or golden brick road, to ask the wizard, the banker, for help in getting back to Kansas, reality. Along the way, she meets a scarecrow who needs brains. This is said to represent the farmer's need for the knowledge to challenge the banker's plans. The Tin Man, who needed a heart, said to possibly represent industry and the need for it to fulfill the needs of the people. And a cowardly lion, who perhaps represents the American people's need for the courage to stand up to the trickery of the wizard. But for all the scary imagery and booming voice of the wizard, he is in fact just a little man behind a curtain, pulling the strings of a grand and elaborate deception. And how is it that Dorothy will return to Kansas? Why, by clicking her silver slippers, of course. That's right. Dorothy's slippers were in fact silver in the original book, and not ruby as they are in the film. Because to challenge the wizard, she must of course click her silver slippers to escape the pseudo-empirical gold-backed trickery of the wizard and return to the reality of a simple farming life in Kansas, because after all, there's no place like home. Unfortunately, however, the outcome in reality didn't match the happy ending in Oz. This passage of history came to signify the last great battle with the money changers, coming to a head on December the 23rd, 1913, when they finally got their privately owned Federal Reserve System installed in America. The US President at the time, Woodrow Wilson, later remarking, "I am a most unhappy man. I have unwittingly ruined my country. A great industrial nation is now controlled by its system of credit. We are no longer a government by free opinion, no longer a government by conviction and the vote of the majority, but a government by the opinion and duress of a small group of dominant men." This and the other banking coups have all but been erased from the pages of history until recently. However, this information is now coming to the surface through the advent of the internet, and not a moment too soon, as the stakes in the game couldn't be higher, with the banking elite's dominance now global in scope, and almost all nations on Earth having a central bank based on the system of fractional reserve banking. The game is almost over, and the bad news is that we the people are not only losing this war, but most of us do not even know we're in one, having been tied up in a web of economic jargon, folly and abstraction to fool us into thinking this is anything other than just a good old-fashioned scam. But why is it that despite being regularly thwarted, a small group of international bankers repeatedly comes back from the dead to ransack the public coffers? Well, because that's what money as a behavioural reinforcing mechanism inherently gravitates towards. It should come as no surprise that in a hierarchical game based on self-preservation and self-maximisation, that those with an advantage would seek to orchestrate and refine its rules in their favour if possible, further consolidating their position of power and dominance. More on this later. So what is the money changers' method to come back and regain control over money creation? Problem, reaction, solution. The oldest trick in the book. In much the same way as a honey trap can be set to blackmail a person, so a money trap can be set to create a problem in the economy, giving the monetary powers the opportunity to ultimately blackmail the population into giving them and their allies in the financial arena a monopoly over money creation. This bribe comes in the shape of the promise of less volatile economic times in exchange for a monopoly over the creation of a nation's credit through private banks. Thus, the title of this presentation is The Money Trap. So let's take a brief look at the history of this battle over money creation to see if this is indeed not the first time that we have found ourselves in this position, and hopefully these past lessons should enable us to learn from history so that this time round it doesn't repeat itself. Part 1. The Money Wars. This trap has been extremely well refined over the years, to the point where it has engulfed the entire planet in a web of debt. It really doesn't matter what the label of your last lender of resort is, be it the Bank of England, the Fed, the IMF or the World Bank, when all the money in the global economy is created out of thin air by private interests through debt with interest applied. The long-term ramifications will always be the concentration of wealth in the hands of a few and the boom and bust of the business cycle, for what goes up must come down. The mathematics of this system amount to what is essentially a game of musical chairs, as even if every pound, dollar, rupee and shekel in existence were to be paid back to the private institutions that created it in the first place, then the interest on the principal of those loans would still be owed. This means that when these are called in, someone has to miss out, and this is why the debt will never ever be paid off under the fractional reserve-based banking system. Money is pumped into the economy to create growth, often through frivolous lending or low interest rates. Then these loans can be called in and interest rates raised to starve the economy of liquidity, in turn seizing more assets for the banks in the form of repossessions and buying up businesses that can no longer pay their loans for pennies on the dollar. I would state at this point, however, that it is not so much a giant conspiracy as much as an expected system consequence. These elite financiers are not hundreds of years old. This is the natural outgrowth of a system based on competitive advantage and gaming theory. Getting rid of bankers or the elite will not resolve the problem if the rules of the game remain the same. More on this later. But firstly, where did all this fairy tale banking get started? Well, the best place to start a story is at the beginning, so here goes. Banking's earliest beginnings are attributed to roughly 800 BC in Mesopotamia. Its purpose was to facilitate trade by providing a safe place to store money and provide loans in advance for trade. This was the start of the money changers' story, who were in full swing in Rome prior to and during the reign of Julius Caesar. In 48 BC, Caesar chose to coin his own money and provide an abundant money supply for the population's use. Caesar ushered in a time of great economic prosperity in the Roman Republic. Short-lived as it was to be, however, with him meeting a grisly end, receiving 23 stab wounds from a group of assassins in 44 BC. A fate that some historians theorize was in part to his coining of money for the use of the people. Later, in the times of Jesus, the money changers had cornered the market on the only coin that the Jews could use to pay their taxes for religious reasons, the silver half shekel. They then raised the price of its use to extortionate amounts. This act of monopolizing the use of currency is said to have outraged Jesus so much that he stormed into the temple where the moneylenders were operating and drove them out, turning over their tables in the process, the only time he was said to have used violence in his ministry. Fast forward to medieval England, and the currency that eventually won the day here and soon everywhere else on the planet was the easily coinable and rare commodity of gold, birthing a new kind of moneylender, the goldsmith. Gold was cumbersome and heavy to carry around, however, and so the goldsmith set up shop to keep people's gold for safekeeping for a fee, in exchange for paper receipts for the gold deposited with him. After a while, he realised that it was rare for people to come back and check on their gold, and usually never all at once. So he realised that he could lend out more of his paper receipts at interest without actually having to have the gold to back them up. This was the start of fractional reserve banking. With only a fraction of the actual gold to back up the loan, the goldsmith could effectively collect money out of thin air with interest applied. As he started to flaunt this newfound wealth, however, the people often got wise to his trickery and turned up to collect their gold. When it could not be produced, Mr. Goldsmith could find himself in rather a spot of bother. But collusion is better than confrontation, so it came to pass that certain less scrupulous individuals in society realised they could get in on the scam if they allowed their gold to be used as a reserve requirement for new loans at interest, and so the consolidation of wealth and power began in earnest. As it did, so did the ability to buy more gold and seize ever more control over the money supply. One of the first to thwart this practice was Henry I in England in 1100 AD by implementing a tally stick system. This was a wooden stick with notches engraved in its marker for monetary creation. Eventually the stick could be split with the borrower and the lender so that each had a record of the transaction. Taxes could only be paid in this way, which was impossible to forge as every notch was cut slightly differently, so it could only match its authentic other half. This system, although sounding primitive, was in fact an extremely reliable and robust form of currency, not particularly subject to problems of inflation or economic boom or bust, forging a place in the British economy as it did for a further 726 years. But the money powers were soon trying to find ways to undermine it, but had to wait until the year 1500 and the reign of Henry VIII to get a real chance at doing so. Facing huge war costs, Henry relaxed the laws on usury and let the money changers in through the back door in exchange for some easy money. And so the story goes through the to and fro of monetary creation. King Edward and his successor Queen Mary I tightened the laws on usury. Her sister Queen Elizabeth, upon facing a large debt deficit, had no choice but to reinstate some of Henry VIII's laws as the power pendulum swung in favour of the money changers once again. But a series of costly European wars took their toll on England, and in 1694 the second central bank came into existence in the form of the Bank of England, the first central bank being in Sweden. And what better way to institute the goldsmith's magical money creation than to set up a bank designed to give the people the impression of validity by having the name of the nation in its title. The bank was privately owned by stockholders from its foundation in 1694 until it was nationalised in 1946. However, the power to create money still resides in private hands by commercial banks with the full sanction of the National Bank and the government. The difference in this arrangement is that the buck stops with the government and not the money changers, which is okay for the government to bear as long as it can always lay its hands on more money, which your national bank will dutifully provide through debt with interest applied. In return, the government would service this debt through gradual taxation on the people. Soon, government debt in England soared from £1.2 million in 1694 to £12 million by 1700. This injection of money into the economy caused prices to double, diminishing the purchasing power of the existing money supply and producing the hidden tax we have come to know as inflation, which is a natural consequence of creating money in this way, and a trend that simply cannot be stopped or seriously challenged through the use of fractional reserve banking. Just as we can see in this chart denoting the decrease in purchasing power of the dollar since the implementation of the Federal Reserve System in America in 1913. Speaking of America, that is where the money changers turned their attention to next. By the mid-1700s, the British government borrowed heavily to finance war costs, and as a consequence, the national debt almost doubled, from £75 million in 1754 to £133 million in 1763. Across the Pacific, however, the colonies of America were flourishing. In a meeting with merchants and bankers at the British Board of Trade, members asked Benjamin Franklin how the American colonies managed to collect enough money to support the poor. Franklin replied, "That is simple. In the colonies we issue our own paper money. It's called colonial scrip. We use it in proper proportion to make the goods pass easily from the producers to the consumers. In this manner, creating ourselves our own paper money, we control its purchasing power and we have no interest to pay to no one." You would like to think that upon hearing this, that England and King George III may have taken a different course of action rather than increasing taxes on the colonies in an attempt to raise funds to repay England's debts. Benjamin Franklin stating in no uncertain terms the effect this action had when he said, "The refusal of King George III to allow the colonies to operate an honest money system, which freed the ordinary man from the clutches of the money manipulators, was probably the prime cause of the revolution." The money changers now opened up their money creation plan on all fronts, but America was to be the fiercest opponent of them all, having multiple attempts at instituting a nationalized banking system in America. This idea was fought by many of the most famous names in US history. President Andrew Jackson arguably loathed the money changers most of all, and was the last US president to ever pay off the entire US national debt in 1835. The bankers' taste for power does not come without a sense of irony, it would seem, with Jackson's face now adorning their privately owned Federal Reserve $20 bill. And Abraham Lincoln once said, "I see in the future a crisis approaching that unnerves me and causes me to tremble for the safety of my country." As a result of the war, corporations have been enthroned and an era of corruption in high places will follow, and the money power of the country will endeavour to prolong its reign by working upon the prejudices of the people until all wealth is aggregated in a few hands and the republic is destroyed. I feel at this moment more anxiety for the safety of my country than ever before, even in the midst of war. Unfortunately, the signing of the Federal Reserve Act in 1913 saw Lincoln's suspicions come true and the beginning of the end of the money wars. Since then, the financial powers have extended their reach over the entire planet, creating the most insidious and all-encompassing system of plutocratic control humanity has ever endured. But don't take my word for it. Let's take a look at the master money changer himself, Amschel Rothschild, who once said, "Let me issue and control a nation's money, and I care not who writes the laws." So in part 2, a system of collapse, let's take a look at the effects this system is having. First expected result of 100 years of this system in America is runaway debt, with US debt standing at $16.7 trillion. And as of 2:40 PM and 32 seconds on September the 5th, 2013, global debt stood at $51,737,303,387,005. You may wonder why I'm being so specific. Well, That is because it goes up by the tune of $1 million every 5 seconds. Seriously, how much more ridiculous does this have to get? $51 trillion? Pardon me, but what the fuck are we doing? How can a planet be in debt to itself? Who do we owe the money to? Mars? How insane do things have to get before we realise that there is more than just a little something wrong around here? The recent shoots of recovery are nothing more than a respite from the storm, because you cannot solve the problems of debt by creating more money out of debt. This system has to cause periodic debt collapse. It's a mathematical impossibility for it to do otherwise. For even if we were to pay back the debt, we will never pay back the interest, because it never existed in the initial loan. Along with debt collapse, this system also ensures that over time, the gap between the super rich and everyone else will continue to grow. As things stand, 1% of humanity now owns 46% of the world's wealth, rather than the previous figure of 40%. 80% live on less than $10 a day, 50% on less than $3, and a sixth of the planet's human population are starving to death on less than $1.25 a day. And this trend of income inequality is growing, which we can see from the growing ratio of rich to poor countries. The distance between the richest and poorest countries were 3 to 1 in 1820, 11 to 1 in 1913, 35 to 1 in 1950, 44 to 1 in 1973, and 72 to 1 in 1992. Such inequality between nations serves to give financial speculators more leverage to crash a poorer nation's currency, making it fertile ground for major corporations to swoop in, extract its resources, and take advantage of cheap labour. Of course, when this is resisted by a nation who does not want to play ball, then there is always that greatest of all profit-making industries that can step into the fray: war. War works very well for the money changers, which is why you can often find them financing both sides in a conflict, or at least the one who looks most likely to further its interests. In this industry, you get to blow countries up so your corporations can go and rebuild them, ensuring access and dominance of that nation's resources. In terms of income inequality, the average income of the richest 10% of the population is now 9 times that of the poorest 10%, up 7-fold from what it was 25 years ago. In an example closer to home, the richest 1,000 people in the UK in 2008 were worth approximately £300 billion. Today, they are worth a staggering £415 billion, an increase of £115 billion at a time when the public are being told that the public coffers need to be ransacked to pay the national debt. A debt that could be cleared by this group of people alone, and they would still have 30 billion spare change. So what effect does income inequality have on human health in a given society? Detailed research by the Equality Trust and others show that the greater the level of income inequality in society, the greater the detrimental effect on both the rich and poor in that society. Whether it's life expectancy, infant mortality, homicides, rates of imprisonment, obesity, levels of social trust, teenage pregnancy, mental illness, drug addiction, child happiness, or educational scores, people in more equal societies tend to do better in all areas of social, physical, and mental health. So much for inequality. What about the effect this system has with regards to the use of our finite planetary resources? Well, it requires that an ever-growing number of people go into debt to service it and fuel consumption. No consumption, no debt, no money. This effect could be referred to as cyclical consumption, which is the need for the speed up in circulation between the 3 players on the economic stage: the employer, the employee, and the consumer. This means that nothing produced can last longer than what is needed to maintain cyclical consumption, resulting in using shoddy methods of production, as well as deliberately making products to break down respectively fast for resale of said product to maintain consumption. This means that we will need 2 Earths by 2030 to keep on our current rates of consumption. The last remaining rainforest could be consumed in less than 40 years. Species are going extinct at roughly 1,000 times their normal rate due to human activity. Over 70% of the world's fish species are disappearing at an alarming rate due to overfishing, and 99% of the materials used in the manufacturing of products ends up as waste within 6 weeks. So we can see that we do not live in an economy at all, but an anti-economy. Part 3. The Golden Rule. No, not this one, but the true Golden Rule. That being, he who has the gold makes the rules. The money men are the real ones running this world, not the politicians and certainly not the people. The bank bailouts in 2008 cost around $29 trillion, and the cost of implementing a worldwide renewable energy infrastructure in that same year was approximately $22 trillion, and the money went to the banks instead. This should be expected as a direct consequence of the psychological effect of monetary acquisition itself. More is never enough. A recent study at the University of California, Berkeley suggests that the more affluent you are, the more likely you are to behave unethically. In a series of experiments involving everything from dangerous driving to lying in job negotiations and cheating to get a prize, researchers found that across the board, the rich behaved worse. However, rather than class, the tests suggest that simple greed seemed more likely to explain the difference. This study should come as no surprise. Just like every kid going out on Halloween knows, if you want a decent amount of sweets at the end of the night, then you don't go knocking on the big houses' doors. This is not an effort to demonize the rich. Some of the super rich do indeed give a large portion of their fortunes away. But is this what we are to rely on as a way of redistributing society's wealth? By hoping that those who've learned to play the game of differential advantage better than everyone else will suddenly decide to abandon the psychology that got them to where they are in the first place? And play nice? Besides, in their world, they are playing fair, because they worked hard for what they've got, and you could be rich too, were you just to work a little harder. This is absurd, of course, as well as a mathematical impossibility, for no matter how hard you try, when the music stops in this system, someone always has to lose. Just take a look at the recent comments of member of the Super Rich Club Kevin O'Leary, who, when given the news that the richest 85 people on the planet now have more wealth than the bottom 3.5 billion put together, stated that he was overjoyed with the news. And were these people simply to work harder, then they too could be rich. Okay, Kevin, I'm sure you believe in putting your money where your mouth is, so I will personally pay for a one-way ticket for you to go to sub-Saharan Africa with no wallet and just the clothes you stand in. Change your name and start again, and if you end up rich, then we'll know you were right. I'm sure we can all agree with the sentiment of hard work, but hard work for what end? The money required to eradicate hunger for everyone in the world has been estimated at $30 billion a year. It's a huge sum of money. About as much as the world spends on the military every 8 days. If this is the sort of hard work I'm being asked to engage in, to work my nuts off morning, noon and night to support a so-called civilized society that is designed to produce this, then I say no. I'd rather not, thanks. Poor societal health, poverty, environmental destruction and war should be completely expected as the natural outgrowth of such a system. It's just that these factors have taken a while for the chickens to come home to roost. There are many critics who highlight the problems brought up in this talk, and their solutions vary between sound money creation, a return to the gold standard, local currencies and so on, all of which could be commendable in their short-term use perhaps, but they will not resolve the root causality of the issues mentioned. This time we need to have the courage to go further. Think about it. The money changers keep coming back, right? So why is reforming money going to magically work this time round? Why has it got to the point where they now have a monopoly over almost the entire planet's money supply? Because obviously they are the best at the game called money. And how do you go about stopping them playing that game? Simple. By taking their toys away. That's right, folks. I'm afraid we have to get rid of money entirely. And the good news is that we can. This is not the first time this idea has been suggested, of course. Communism's aims were for a society with no money or class, but it failed to appreciate the technical function to which money serves, not to mention the fact that forcing people to give up their rights or their property is not only not very nice, it doesn't work to promote a peaceful world. peace does. This is why non-violent peaceful resistance and non-participation with this system of the sort seen by Martin Luther King and Gandhi is the most effective route to bring about a change to any suggested system that we would like to be more peaceful and balanced. Violence begets violence. The best way of overcoming any system is by building a new one that makes the existing model obsolete. Scientist and engineer Buckminster Fuller put this sentiment best when he said, "You never change things by fighting the existing reality. To change something, build a new model that makes the existing model obsolete." And the function to which money serves is real or contrived scarcity. And what is the enemy of scarcity? Abundance. Part 4. From Scarcity to Abundance. The underpinning of the scarcity-orientated form of economics that is money is labour for income. Contrary to popular opinion, the largest threat to the job market historically is the displacement of human labour by machines, otherwise known as technological unemployment, which is on pace to render the labour for income game obsolete. The exponential increase in technological capability, as well as its decrease in price over time, means that as soon as it becomes affordable to replace a human with a robot, it will be. This is also known as the contradiction of capitalism, for if you displace the workers, then who will have the money to buy your products and services? In an economy based on efficiency and abundance, why not liberally automate monotonous and meaningless jobs, which is basically nearly all of them, and move towards full unemployment as quickly as possible? That is what technology is meant to do. Make life easier so that we can do the things we want to do, not enslave us to a system in which 80% of people say that they hate their job. So this system is coming to a close whether we like it or not, through a combination of resource depletion, debt collapse and technological unemployment. But as the saying goes, you close one door and another one opens. And that door for us is an entirely possible and feasible economy of access abundance for all the world's people. We can have an economic system that is designed towards preserving our planet's finite resources and meets human needs, or continue to use our current scarcity-orientated one. We finally have a choice to cast off the more negative aspects of our primitive roots and take advantage of the fantastic and hugely withheld potential of our current technological capability to meet the needs of every man, woman and child on this planet. For such a transition in human life to take place, we will need open collaboration on a global scale, taking all interacting factors into account. The time for separation is over. Borders are simply lines drawn out by people in power long ago, seeking to preserve their interests. Such interests nature, quite simply, does not take into consideration, I'm afraid, so as far as I'm concerned, neither should we. The system which can deliver this aim could be deemed a natural law resource-based economy, or NLRBE for short. The definition of such an economic model is the application of the scientific method for social concern. If we do not have an alternative economic model rooted in the best decision-making process we have ever come to know of applied to the natural world in which we exist, then I am afraid we are condemned to repeat our past errors over and over again. As mentioned earlier, it is not the business of this presentation to go through the tenets of an NLRBE in great detail. The idea rightly raises many worthwhile questions that deserve evidence-based answers. Answers that can be found in the materials mentioned at the beginning of this presentation. However, it is perhaps worth briefly noting the levels of efficiency that could be produced by such a system were our actual technological capability not hindered by the use of a monetary system's need for scarcity and inefficiency. For example, whether it is the clean and renewable maglev train systems that can travel at speeds of up to 4,000 miles an hour safely and use just 2% the energy of planes, or the hundreds of times more efficiency in food production that can be achieved in the use of hydroponics and vertical farming, it's clear that we have simply outgrown the usefulness that a monetary system once had, and this archaic, abstract and immature system simply has to go, and it can if we want it to. And this is where the Zeitgeist Movement comes in. The movement is an educational, non-political sustainability advocacy group engaged in spreading positive value orientations to the surrounding culture. aiming to inform people regarding the amazing possibilities an NLRBE could deliver should we choose to adjust our values accordingly. For whilst we should of course be nullifying our reliance on this system wherever possible, be careful of who we bank with and what we consume, without communicating a new train of thought on which to orientate people's values and intentions, we should expect to see much of the same thing, as we will be engaging in little more than patchwork to a system that is simply not fit for purpose anymore. I suppose the sentiment of this talk was summed up a long time ago in this old native Indian proverb. Only when the last tree has died, and the last river been poisoned, and the last fish been caught, will we realise that we cannot eat money. Because for a long time now, the world's religious leaders, philosophers and writers have been proposing notions of how the world can become a more peaceful, happy and joyful place in which for us all to live. But the ability to technically achieve the abundance required for such a globally collaborative system was never a reality until now. We've achieved so much as a species, and to our knowledge are the greatest evolutionary success story this universe has ever created. Quite simply, we are amazing, and together there is nothing we can't do. We've changed before, and we can do it again, but not without effort, so I'm afraid the first change has to start with you, not someone else. In the final analysis, we are one people, and we share one planet.